Welcome back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Robbie Whelan of the Wall Street Journal. Now, Robbie is on the show because he has been writing about the big change at Disney. We've got Bob Iger back, Bob Chapek out, lots of stuff going on. But the reason specifically I reached out to Robbie was because he wrote a piece about the Disney parks. And the Disney parks are an enormous piece of the Disney infrastructure, the Disney business world that I simply don't have a good grasp on because I'm a movie guy. I'm a movie and a TV guy. I know that. I don't know the parks as well. But there's a lot of discomfort amongst the faithful about how the parks are working. And I want to have Robbie on to talk about it. So thank you for being on the show, Robbie. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So what is going on with the parks? Could you actually, before we even talk about that, could you just kind of explain to folks how big the parks are as a percentage or in relation to the rest of the Disney empire and universe? Sure.
When we talk about operating income generated by Disney, which is another word for profit, in the last quarter, the DPEP, which is Disney's Parks and Experiences division, was responsible for north of 90% of the company's profit for the quarter. Over the last year, they're responsible for about 2/3 of the company's profit. And the reason why that's important is that Disney is spending a ton of money right now on streaming. Because that's what Wall Street told them to do. When they launched Disney Plus, they got essentially a green light from investors, some of whom were even kind of coming and talking to the board, talking to Bob Iger at the time, who was CEO back then in 2019, and saying, guys, go for it. Spend everything you've got on streaming. Dan Loeb, one of the activist investors who has been in touch with Disney, even wrote a letter to Disney saying, guys, suspend your dividend, plow all that cash into Disney Plus, and really do a good job on building a streaming platform that will compete with Netflix. And that's what the company did. So I've tallied it up many times, but as of last quarter, Disney's losses on streaming, on the direct-to-consumer segment, were north of $8 billion in just 3 years. And that's an enormous amount of money for this, even for a big company like Disney. So you need something to subsidize those losses. And that thing is the parks division. Well, it's the parks division and it's linear TV, because ESPN, much as people talk about the secular decline of cable, cord cutting and cable TV kind of being going the way of the Stone Age, that business still does generate a lot of cash for Disney. So it's two things: linear TV and parks that are providing this flow of cash that allows Disney to lose a lot of money on streaming.
Yeah. The way I heard somebody describe Disney once was it's essentially a park operator and a TV network operator and a cable network operator with a movie studio kind of attached on the side. Just off to the edges a bit. Right.
And of course, it's not always been that way. They acquired ABC and ESPN in the mid 90s. So for, the first 75 years of Disney's existence, it really was a movie studio and not much else. And I guess a movie studio and a merchandise business. But since the mid 90s, after the changes made by Michael Eisner, the parks and the linear TV business have really taken on much more strategic importance. And, another important point here is that during the pandemic, during the worst days of the pandemic, when everyone was kind of glued to their couch and there were lockdown orders in effect, Disney Plus was the paramount idea on every executive's mind at the company. I mean, because you couldn't go to theaters, you couldn't go to the theme parks. I mean, Disneyland was closed for about a year. Walt Disney World was closed for only a few months, but this had a huge impact. I mean, they fired tens of thousands of people. Or laid them off rather, and after that, it became very difficult to attract them back to go wear these big fuzzy vinyl costumes in 85-degree heat in 100% humidity in Florida. I mean, these are not fun jobs. They're done for the love of it, and when you get laid off, it's not a simple thing to kind of bring back staffing. And so what I'm saying is that the pandemic catapulted Disney Plus to the front and center in terms of relevance. But when the pandemic eased and the parks reopened, suddenly things flipped. And it was the parks that were, first of all, producing record amounts of money, revenue and income both. but also became much, much more important and sort of the reemerged, so to speak, as the crown jewel of the company.
Yeah, so let's talk about the parks and how things have been going and how they changed a little bit. Because one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I pull back the curtain a little bit. I took my family to go to Disney World earlier this year, and it was great. We had a wonderful time. I had a lot of fun, and I talked about this online. And every time I bring it up online, I will get messages from regulars who are like, "Man, it's too bad you couldn't have gone back in the good old days when it was, before all the new stuff." And I have no frame of reference here. I have no frame of reference. So what were some of the changes that Bob Chapek instituted that helped increase the profitability, but also turn some of the regulars against what was going on?
Yeah. So to answer that question, so Sonny, what your credit card bill looks like after a visit to Disneyland or Disney World. I mean, I do too. I have little kids, and when I go, they have an absolute blast, and it's like whatever. It's Super 8 cam family heart melting moments left and right. But when you get home is when the real reckoning happens, because you spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars even on a day trip there. I think that the simple answer is that things have just gotten a lot more expensive at Disney's theme parks, and what was once a kind of like quintessential vacation for middle class Americans, a few days at Disney World on spring break or whatever it is, is really much more out of reach to those same Americans, and it's become, like many things in this world, an exclusive club. You got to know somebody. You got to be a member of some benefits program, or you got to have the right credit card to get the right discount. And it's very frustrating. I mean, it's the same thing with concert tickets that we see today. I tried to get tickets to a Bruce Springsteen concert recently, and it's damn near impossible. You have to be the super fan of the super fans and signed up for all the right lists. And I think that a lot of people think that's how Disney is starting to feel in terms of its theme parks. But the more nuanced or complex answer, I guess, is that it goes back to the staffing issues I mentioned, right? So the origin of all the changes that Bob Chapek made to the parks was that he was having a seriously hard time restaffing the parks upon reopening. And it's also that's also sort of the origin of kind of the I Hate Bob Chapek campaign among a lot of the fans and the and the cast members, as they're called, the employees of the parks. But it's sort of hard to lay all the blame squarely at his feet, right? I mean, the company had to do something. They couldn't continue to employ full-time, 30,000 people or more when there was no one coming to the parks. And so they had to do something. They had to lay people off. But the unfortunate truth of it is when they came back, people didn't want to come back. So Disney had to do something they'd never done before, which was they had to sort of limit the number of people who came to the parks each day, and they had to know exactly how many people were going to come each day so they could essentially run the parks on a skeleton crew and deploy labor where they needed it. So it was a labor deployment issue initially. What it became was something different, which was it became a cash cow. I mean, the company very quickly realized that when there's fewer people at the park, people have a better time because they're not waiting in these incredibly long lines all day. They're not having to elbow their way through crowds to get their, pineapple Dole Whip frozen treat. They're not having to. It's just a lot more pleasant to be at a place that where the attendance is kept in check for many reasons. And so the company put in place this online reservation system right when the parks reopened. Initially a labor-saving, labor management tool, but then they realized that people were spending more, and so this online reservation system became more important. It was like people are happy to open their wallets when they're having a better time. So let's really use this reservation system to kind of make the customer experience a little bit better. Then what they did was they also, sort of around the same time or shortly after they introduced this online reservation system, they launched something called Genie Plus, which is it's not a smartphone app, but it's a smartphone app feature. So it's inside the My Disney Experience app, which everyone downloads when they goes to a Disney park. And what it does is it tells you what the wait time is on pretty much any ride at the park. And if you use the paid version, Genie Plus, the free version is just called Genie. If you use the paid version, which started out costing something like $15 a day on top of the price of your ticket, you got to skip the lines, the main lines, what are called standby lines on about 20 or 30 popular rides at the park. So this is a really great tool, right? You go and you have your kids, and everyone, kids are eventually melting down and crying and hot and sweaty and don't want to be standing in a line. They want to be on a ride. If you had Genie Plus, you got to skip about half of the rides that we're talking about here that you would normally otherwise have to wait in. And it not only became this benefit, it also became pretty much essential to having a good time at Disney. I mean, I know this from personal experience. If I'd gone to Disney with my kids and not paid for Genie Plus, I would have gone on, maybe 3 rides all day instead of the 6 or 7 that I did. It's a fantastic cost-saving tool, and it's really worth the price. But then Disney started raising the price on it and everything else. So now on a high volume day at Walt Disney World in Florida, meaning like there's a lot of demand that day, it's during high season, you're paying $29 a ticket for Genie Plus, for this add-on that allows you to have a good time. But wait, it doesn't end there. We also have something called Individual Lightning Lane that was also introduced after the pandemic reopenings, which is basically like, this is for the creme de la creme rides. We're talking about Star Wars, Rise of the Resistance. We're talking about Ratatouille. We're talking about Radiator Springs Adventure, like all these really good rides that people want to go on. And I can tell you from experience that Rise of the Resistance is an amazing attraction. It's probably the most amazing theme park attraction I've ever been on. It's 20 minutes of being pretty much as close as you can get to inside an action film with a galactic space battle happening all around you. It's incredibly exciting. It costs a huge amount of money. We reported in a story earlier this month that ride costs $450 million for each version of it, for one in Anaheim and one in Orlando, and it's really worth it. It's what people inside Disney call an intent to visit ride, meaning people will plan their entire visit or their entire day around getting on Rise of the Resistance. Those rides, if you want to, they're not covered by Genie Plus, by this basic kind of ride skipping feature. If you want to skip the line for that one, you got to pay another fee. $15 or $20, it varies now, and they've been raising the rates on those too. So in a very short time, like I'm talking about the last 6 months, basically, Bob Chapek's team at the parks, under Josh D'Amaro, who's the head of the parks, they realized there's a lot of headroom for what we can ask visitors to pay in order to make sure they're having the best time possible at Disney. And so, And if you look at, it doesn't take long to sort of look online to figure out what fan reaction is to these changes. It's incredibly negative, and I don't mean like just a few things here and there. It is the entire discourse, the entire dialogue about Disney parks right now is how upset people are with these changes and the nickel and diming that they feel is happening. And two other really quick things are, one is that the online reservation system is offensive primarily to people who are what are called these legacy fans, people who have annual passes, people who go more than 10 or 12 times a year. And there's a really pretty huge group of people, especially at Disneyland and Anaheim, who live nearby and they have an annual pass, and they would just get done with work at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and they'd go and spend a couple hours at Disneyland because they really loved it. I mean, I interviewed a guy for a story about a month and a half ago, who told me that his best friend introduced him to Disneyland. His best friend was a FedEx delivery guy, I believe, and he introduced him to Disneyland. It was his favorite place to go in the world. Had an annual pass, and this guy died of a massive heart attack in his sleep a few years after first taking his friend to Disneyland. And the guy I interviewed said, the only place I feel like I commune with my dead best friend is at Disneyland. So I used to go there and I'd walk around. I wouldn't even do anything. I wouldn't ride rides. I would just buy an ice cream cone, see the lights. And it really felt to me like I was, seeing this guy who I lost from my life. And that's what they describe as the magic of a place like Disneyland. It has these memories that have an incredibly strong nostalgic pull to them, and they're very, very sentimental. So so the annual pass holders are the primary people who were upset about this online reservation system because it suddenly was snatched away from them. They couldn't just go whenever they wanted. They had to make reservations sometimes weeks or months in advance. Sometimes the days they wanted to go were completely booked up and full, and there were no open spots for them. That's one thing to consider. And the other thing to consider is that Disney has very strategically decided that the people they want to focus on bringing to the parks are these kind of like once in a lifetime visitors. Often they're foreign visitors. I'm sure have you heard this term, unfavorable mix?
No.
This was a big deal in August during the earnings call. Bob Chapek told investors that the parks results had not been quite as good as they could have been because of an unfavorable mix of visitors. And Disney fans seized on this. They started making T-shirts that said "unfavorable." It was kind of like his Hillary Clinton basket of deplorables moment.
That's a total deplorables thing,
right? So they said, oh, you're talking about us, the people who are your super fans. We're the unfavorable ones, and you'd rather have a family from China who's going to come and spend $10,000 a day, on a private custom guide to the parks and not hold back, stay in your on-site hotels that cost $2,000 a night for a suite. Really, the whales who come to Disneyland and Disney World, that's who they saw that comment directed at or referring to. Basically, we want the whales. We don't want anybody else. So those are two very important factors here in kind of how Bob Chapek lost fans on the parks. I mean, he was really very unpopular with fans, and there was a lot of sort of bad energy out there about him, which is also kind of interesting because he was not the head of the parks when all these changes were made. Josh D'Amaro, who's extremely popular. I've walked the parks with Josh D'Amaro. He was stopped maybe 50 times by people asking for selfies, wanting to thank him for the job he was doing. He's basically a celebrity, a corporate celebrity, but he somehow escapes blame for any of these changes, even though they were all made under his watch. But I think people know that Bob Chapek was once head of the Parks Division and that he came up through the Parks Division, and they see him as kind of this, a guy who knows how to squeeze a lot of juice out of the lemon, and that's why they associate these changes with him.
Well, let me ask, because it sounds, this is almost the opposite of the way you expect a big corporation like Disney to work, right? The guy found a way to make a lot of money, and really increase profitability of one segment of the business, but basically gets ousted for that because the actual consumers turned against him. I mean, it's such an unusual sort of thing. Like, usually in these situations, you see the penny pinchers and the nickel and dimers like really succeed, and not here. I mean, is it merely a function of fan unrest? Is that just the long and the short of it? You mean
his ouster?
Yes.
So here's where I got to be careful, because we don't know yet the entire story here. I mean, every me and my competitors, we've all sort of landed on kind of the same narrative to a certain extent, which is that we all know, and it's been confirmed, and my reporting and other people's reporting show that it was Christine McCarthy. I mean, she was the one who went to the board, complained that she had lost confidence in him and that the company was going in the wrong direction under him. Now, you might think I agree with you. It might seem odd that the CFO, whose job is to control costs and sort of make the balance sheet look as good as possible, would have lost confidence in a penny pincher or a cost cutter or somebody who knows how to maximize revenue quite well. But she did, and we don't know yet all the details about why she lost confidence in him. So it's hard to say at this moment from where I'm sitting, 10:30 Western time on Wednesday, that he lost his job because he lost the confidence of fans at the parks. But it's hard also to discount that as a reason. Because of the importance of the parks. If the parks are starting to see cracks, which they are, and I can get into that in a moment, but if the parks are starting to see cracks, and that's the engine driving investment in every other part of the company, that's absolutely going to be a serious concern for Disney's board, for its top executives, and it's going to be the source of frustration for a lot of people who work very hard to make sure that the parks run smoothly and are satisfying to visitors. So yeah, just to get into the numbers of it a little bit, I mean, Disney's profit margins at the park fell by 16 percentage points in the last quarter. That's really striking. I mean, that's about twice what they fell by in 2019, the last pre-pandemic year. They usually fall between the third and fourth quarter as everyone goes back to school and families kind of readjust to their normal schedules. Yeah, people stop coming and spending as much money at the Disney parks as they were during the summertime. That's why you see that number go down. But I have investor sources, guys who work at media hedge funds who will say to me, I wouldn't touch Disney with a 10-foot pole right now, because the really solid business they have undergirding everything else, the parks, is starting to show a little bit of flashing red warning signs. And that's very troubling to, I think, a lot of people on Wall Street and a lot of people within the company. So yeah, again, I'm not going to say right here and now that losing the parks is why Chapek got axed, but I'm not going to discount that as part of the whole equation.
Yeah, can you talk about any of the other cracks in the Disney park? I mean, besides the big one, obviously, the decline in profit percentage.
The kind of profit margins, and there's kind of like there's also just kind of this general sense that people are just very unhappy, and there's that is sort of more subjective, obviously, but the I had somebody tell me that they couldn't remember a time when sort of the discourse about Disney was this negative, and people wearing T-shirts saying like "F Bob Chapek" at the parks, and without fear of being asked to take them off, and there's things like that, right, which are a little bit squishy and hard to sort of nail down as kind of a direct reason for things. But we've also heard, there's also some other signs that seem to be more a little bit more clear, like signals that are a little more clear cutting through the noise. For example, they're offering discounts on some of their premium products that we've never seen before. We've got the Galactic Star Cruiser, which is this ridiculous $5,000 for 2 nights, and you get to basically be like a LARPer inside of the Star Wars universe for 2 nights, and you're in a cabin, you're in this tiny cabin that you've paid thousands of dollars a night for. But the whole appeal of it is that if you're a Star Wars nerd, you get to kind of like be part of this mission, and nobody breaks character, and you can really like live out your wildest Star Wars nerd fantasies for a couple nights. And it's really real. It feels really, it feels like you're right there. And they launched this attraction in Florida in March of this year. It was everyone was like, the whole story about it was how shockingly expensive it was, and how this is just a sign that Disney's kind of like further catering to specialized customers and not to the everyman. It's not every Joe Schmo from Ohio who's going to go and stay on 2 nights on the Galactic Star Cruiser. It's the most ardent Star Wars fans, and not only that, but the ones who are affluent enough to be able to afford that kind of a vacation. We saw about a week ago, we saw the first ever discounts offered on that. So 30% off, still pretty expensive, but a source of mine, or a guy who I quoted, a former Imagineer, these are the sort of Green Berets of the parks who design all the rides, told me, what that means is they've come close to running through all their most ardent Star Wars fans, and they're trying to open this up at least a little bit to kind of the everyman, and that's a big sign, right? If you're a company that's totally confident in its revenue from super fans and in the engagement of super fans and their willingness to kind of spend all their money on your products, doesn't offer discounts on those very same products, it just doesn't happen. Yeah. So it's clearly a response to demand. Either kind of being tapped out a little bit, or maybe they're showing some signs of weakness in demand there for that. But that's one sign. There's a lot of kind of tea leaves that sort of suggest that maybe the parks aren't quite as solid ground as the company would like them to be. Not to mention, we're probably about to enter a recession or something like a recession, and Chapek really has not. I mean, if you listen, the other thing you have to understand is that there was this. People really care about. 2 things: the way Disney sounds and the way their executive sounds on investor calls after their quarterly earnings reports come out. And second, guidance. Disney never gives guidance. This is like a historic thing for the company. They never tell people what's coming or what they think is coming in terms of like what the numbers are going to be, what sales are going to be. And they've started to have to do that. And this really began kind of in the COVID era, because when Disney Plus launched, they knew they had to spend a ton of money on it, but the bargain they made with Wall Street was, you let us spend all this money that we're raising from you guys on Disney Plus, but we're going to be open and transparent about Disney Plus and what our goals are and what our targets are for how many subscribers we'd like to have. So what you've had was, in late 2021, I believe, or late 2020 rather, at Disney's annual meeting, Chapek said, we're going to have 230 to 260 million global Disney Plus subscribers by the end of 2024. That was the target they set. And this was kind of shocking. It was kind of shocking that they even gave a target, because Disney never gives, they don't go out there and say, here's what we're going to make on the latest Marvel movie at the box office.
Sure.
They don't even say, here's what we expect in terms of, sales and park tickets. But that all kind of changed at the beginning of the pandemic. And they realized they needed to be more transparent with the street in order to sort of maintain their share price and maintain the confidence of investors. So the situation we're in now is kind of like everything they say is under a microscope and it's watched very closely. And on November 8th, when Disney reported their earnings, and that same day was what people are now describing as Bob Chapek's disastrous earnings call. He basically minimized the impact of macroeconomic factors on the parks. He said the parks are still doing a phenomenal job. The only thing he would concede that might have been challenging for the parks was that Hurricane Ian cost them $65 million by shutting down the parks for a few days, which is just, in a way, it's kind of ludicrous. I mean, the staring down a recession, and you're talking about how the parks are still producing phenomenal results. His CFO, Christine McCarthy, was much more measured. She was like, looking forward. She said demand is still strong right now, but we're kind of keeping an eye on things going forward. Whereas Chapek's out there kind of, chirping about how great everything is going, and that certainly has something to do with why he no longer is CEO.
Well, let me ask about that, because I won't put words in your mouth here. A friend described the call to me. A friend who was on the call described it to me as Chapek sounded psychotic on this call. He sounded like a crazy person, which leads me to I want to wrap up here. I want to get you out of here, get you back to work. But leads me to kind of my last question here is, how much of this shift is just Chapek not having the personality to be the head of Disney, right? Like the head of Disney is an almost political figure. He has to appeal to a broad variety of people, not just fans, but also investors and also artists and also all sorts of, there's a lot of different pots that he's got his hand in. Was Chapek just unsuited for that sort of role in a way that Iger is not? I mean, Iger is much more naturally gifted at this sort of thing, I think, is the sense I get anyway from talking from the few people I've talked to about it.
Yeah, again, want to be careful because, I'm not the kind of guy who's paid for his opinion on things, but I don't know if I would go as far as what your friend said, that he sounded psychotic. He didn't sound to me, at least in like tone and cadence, he didn't sound all that different from the many times I've heard him speak about the company in public before. He's very kind of like, he does have kind of like a storybook voice. He sort of says, I don't want to do an impression, but he'll go and he'll say, Disney's legendary storytelling, continues to be the strongest in the world. He kind of has this sort of, he has a pitchman's affect, yeah. Right? A cadence that really, and I think he maintained that cadence. The issue was that the world changed, not that his tone changed. He didn't really go off the deep end and start sounding like a crazy person. It was that he only sounded crazy relative to the weakness of the results Disney was showing. So it's kind of like, imagine him as the driver of a car and, you're about to go off the end of a half completed bridge and he's kind of looking around at everybody saying like, isn't this a great trip, guys? Isn't this a fun road trip? That was sort of, I think that was kind of the strangeness of that call. And, as far as his personality, look, the guy is very, very different from Bob Iger, and Bob Iger came up through the TV business. He was, he ran ABC and ABC News for a while. He has deep, deep roots in the business of making content. And, this is the guy who greenlit Twin Peaks in the early 90s and put it on ABC primetime, and this is a guy who did things like that won the hearts of creators and artists. Nobody was putting David Lynch series on TV in the early 90s, thinking they were going to, they were going to be, the best thing to go in the Sunday night slot or whatever. I mean, he was a guy who understood, that you have to take risks on creative and you have to let people learn and grow and fail. All these things, all these sort of, trite things that artists say and that investors say about, what they learn about the world and love and life and art. Iger was right there in the thick of all that. He could relate to that, and they could relate to him. And so, there's the example everyone brings up is Scarlett Johansson, right? Disney kind of pulled a switcheroo on her during the pandemic where they did a day-and-date release for Black Widow. She claimed it deprived her of the ability to earn a bonus at the box office because it cannibalized her box office sales. And I've heard numbers as high as like $20 million that she missed out on from that movie going to Disney Plus on the same day as theaters. And Disney, when she sued Disney to kind of recoup those losses, it was a big deal because nobody really sues Disney. So props to ScarJo for taking on Disney in the courts. But but their response to her was they put out this memo that's now infamous, essentially, that said that ScarJo doesn't care about the people affected by COVID, which is just nuts. It's just a nuts thing to say in public. And I don't know who wrote that memo or wrote that response. It's probably somebody deep in the PR machine at Disney. But it happened under Chapek's watch as CEO. And so people look at that and they say, like, what is this guy doing? You can't badmouth talent, especially not A-list talent, just because they have a disagreement with you. And so, look, I don't know. I don't know if he was unsuited to run the company. He had a very good track record up till then. I've talked to him personally face to face, and he said things. He's described to me, I come from the marketing world. I know how to make products feel and seem essential to people, and I know how to sell things. I'm a salesman, and the fact is, he was a very good salesman. He did more to sign up subscribers to Disney Plus than anyone thought he was ever capable of. It was a huge success on the early growth phase. But it really is notable, I think, that now that we're in this kind of phase of raising prices, the next phase after you get customers hooked and sell them the product and make that product indispensable to them is when he's really stumbled and fallen. And I think that you can describe that however you want, or, you can sort of chalk that up to personality or touch or lack thereof. But it is an interesting point for me when I think about this whole thing. And look, if you just watch 10 minutes of video of each of those guys, Bob Iger and Chapek, they're as different could be. I mean, Iger is this suave, confident, they used to call him the mayor of Hollywood. And the real question going forward to me is the Hollywood that Bob Iger was once the mayor of, is it the same place now that he's back? He wasn't there when Netflix lost 70% of its market value because they had a couple bad quarters for signing up subscribers. He wasn't there, when Disney started raising prices, which they're doing in 1 week on Disney Plus. And, he kind of sat out some of the really intense moments in the streaming wars that have happened over the last year. And he's coming back, and you can say, sure, it's a great thing for Hollywood because everyone's going to have their favorite uncle back in town running the biggest empire in town. But maybe, just maybe, Hollywood's not quite running the biggest company in Hollywood is maybe not quite the same as it was when he left Disney. So that to me is kind of the concern. Maybe Chapek wasn't suited to run this company. And certainly Bob Iger was suited in his last stint to run the company. But there's a big question mark about how it's going to go going forward.
Yeah. I always like to close these shows by asking if there's anything I should have asked, if you think there's anything folks should know about Disney or, the parks in particular, or just Disney in general, the streaming wars, whatever. What do you think, folks? What did I fail to ask that folks should know about?
One thing you should, I think people should know, people should be keeping a close eye on Avatar 2. That's what I think is the most exciting thing in Disney's world right now in terms of content. Just because, my theory about Avatar 2 is that it's going to absolutely blow all expectations out of the water simply because, and I tweeted about this last week, it has a release in China. It's the first big movie from Disney, including the last like 7 or 8 Marvel titles, to be shown in China, because Disney's like consistently screwed up things with the censors over there, and like had hired producers and directors and actors who say critical things of China, which just doesn't fly right now in China. But consider the fact that in 2009, when the first Avatar film came out, and it was part of News Corp, or it was part of 20th Century Fox at the time, which actually kind of funny side note is probably why I got hired at the Wall Street Journal, because the first Avatar did so well, and I was hired the year afterwards when budgets were flush. But the first Avatar movie did something like $300 million in China, and it only played on, I think, around 2,000 screens. I mean, there were only about 2,000 screens in China at that time, and IMAX Corp, which is the main 3D exhibitor in China, had 14 screens at the time. Per capita GDP in China at the time was about $3,500 a person. Today there are 80,000 screens in China. There are almost 1,000 IMAX screens, and GDP per capita is about 3 times what it was back then. So when you put that into perspective, I mean, I don't know how to do the differential equation to predict, what the box office draw will be there, but it really kind of boggles the mind, the earnings potential of that movie. And, I know James Cameron's been out there saying, you have to gross, that's going to be the second or third highest grossing movie of all time to even break even. Who knows if that's true? I mean, I have a hard time believing that his combined production and marketing budget tops $1 billion, but whatever, he says it, so he knows better than I do. But just the earnings potential of that movie is really, really kind of stunning, and I'm very excited to watch, what happens and whether or not that movie goes back, because of course that's now part of Disney. 20th Century Studios is now part of Disney. Yeah. Very exciting, and I think sometimes we get kind of caught up in sort of the earnings report and kind of like which division of Disney is doing better and which one's failing. But there's this really exciting part of it, which is watching what movies do, because movies are very exciting. And I don't know, I'll be in the seats at the theater somewhere watching that movie, and then I'll be checking my phone for how it's doing. And I expect those international numbers to come in really, really big, and which will obviously give a lot of gas to Bob Iger on his return. But yeah, or if you want to ask me, you can ask me anything you want about the movies. I'm a big fan of the movies too. Or I follow them pretty closely.
The Avatar 2 is fascinating. I mean, I think I tweeted something like 6 months ago. It was just a big grid with all of the upcoming, big blockbuster movies, and literally the only one I was actually kind of looking forward to was Avatar 2, because it was like Ant-Man 3. Whatever, just an endless stream of Marvel stuff and like Jurassic World sequels and spin-offs and whatever. And I was like, Avatar 2, I'm actually kind of excited for that. And so Cameron said, I mean, it's interesting to me that Cameron is not out there downplaying expectations. He's not trying to tamp anything down. He's out there, he's like, this has to be one of the 5 highest grossing films of all time. And that means it has to gross $2 billion worldwide.
Right.
Crazy. It's a crazy number.
Yeah.
All right, Robbie, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I'll let you get back to work. And make sure to check out his stuff at the Wall Street Journal. His reporting on the parks is really interesting if you are not as well versed in that side of the business as I frankly am not. So I was glad to have him on. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark, and I will be back next week with another episode of The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. See you guys then.